The woman standing behind the front desk of Castellanos had no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. All she saw was a man in a worn black wool coat, carrying a sleeping little girl and clutching a small cake box tied with ribbon, as if whatever lay inside were something precious, and in 3 short seconds, she had already decided exactly what kind of customer he was. The kind who didn't belong in a place like this. She couldn't have known. No one in that warm, marble-floored room could have known, because the man in the faded coat had never let his face appear in a single photograph, had never signed his real name on a single document, and that was precisely the reason he was still alive today. But a child asleep on a father's shoulder carries a weight no scale can measure. Not the weight of that small body, though his arm had gone numb long ago. It was the weight of absolute trust, the way a child surrenders her entire safety to one person, without the faintest doubt, and demands that the person prove worthy of that trust with every careful step. Salvatore Marchetti carried that weight through the snow-misted glass doors on a December evening, his 5-year-old daughter Gianna pressing her cheek against his collar, her steady breath rising in thin wisps through the cold air still clinging to his shoulder. In his other hand, he held the cake box high and away from his body, the way one holds something that cannot be bought again if it's ruined. Inside the box was a cake, just big enough for 2, and a single unlit candle. Today would have been Rosa's birthday. He had promised himself, while driving through the snow-whitened streets, that even if the whole world forgot, he and his daughter would not let the day pass in silence. There are promises people keep, not because they are easy, but because letting go would hurt far more. To the eyes that lifted toward him from the elegant tables, he was only a tired man bringing his child somewhere a little too late, dressed plainer than this place was used to receiving. Not one of them suspected that the name he carried was whispered in careful voices behind closed doors all across the south side of the city. That men who believed themselves powerful still avoided looking him in the eye. That the woman now preparing to turn him away at the door was, this very night, gambling her entire future without the slightest idea. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss the moving stories still to come. 5 hours earlier, before the sun had fully slipped behind the skyscrapers of the downtown district, Delia Brooks had begun her second shift of the day at Castellanos. She was 27 years old, but her shoulders carried the shape of someone who had lived far longer than that. Her brown hair was hastily tied at the nape of her neck with a stretched-out elastic band, a few stubborn strands falling loose to frame a thin face that even exhaustion couldn't erase the natural gentleness from. The uniform she wore had been through more washings than anyone could count, its black fabric fading into ash gray at the places most often rubbed thin, and the shoes on her feet were worn down so badly that she could feel the chill of the stone floor seeping through the soles whenever she stood still for too long. She had stood still for a very long time in her life. That was the thing the people dining at Castellanos never saw. They saw a quiet figure pouring water, clearing plates, wiping spilled wine from spotless white tablecloths, and they forgot her the moment she turned her back and walked away. To them, she was part of the scenery, as invisible as the velvet drapes hanging beside the windows or the golden light spilling down from the crystal chandeliers overhead. But Delia didn't mind that invisibility. Over the years, she had learned that being invisible was sometimes the safest thing a person like her could hope for. What troubled her was Brenda. Brenda Castellano managed the main dining room with the hand of a woman who believed the small measure of power she held was the only thing separating her from the people beneath her. At the beginning of every shift, she made a slow round through the service area, her sharp, cold eyes sweeping over each employee as though searching for a reason to reprimand someone, and she rarely had to search for long. Tonight, she stopped in front of Delia and looked down at her worn shoes, with the kind of expression people reserved for a stain on the carpet. "The tip money from last week," Brenda said, her voice flat and even, as if she were reading an account statement. "I adjusted it. There were a few deductions. You broke 2 glasses this month, remember?" Delia remembered. She remembered very clearly that one of those 2 glasses had shattered because a drunken customer had knocked his hand into her tray, and she remembered that the amount deducted was 3 times more than the real value of those glasses. But she only nodded, because she had learned that objecting to Brenda had never brought anything except shortened shifts and sweetly worded threats about how many other girls out there were ready to take this job, and that was the bitter truth that kept her there. She needed this job in a way only people who had once stood close to the edge of a cliff could understand. The rent for her small room came due on the 1st of every month, steady and unforgiving. She had no one to call when everything collapsed, no other roof to return to, no safety net stretched beneath her, Her parents had been gone for a long time, and life, in its own way, had taught her that she could only rely on her own calloused hands. So she swallowed the words she wanted to say, as she had swallowed them thousands of times before, and she kept moving. But there was one thing Brenda, with all her cold sharpness, had never been able to take from Delia. It was the way she looked at other people. While this entire restaurant was run on the art of looking straight through human beings, Delia had kept the strange habit of truly seeing them. She noticed the man sitting alone at the corner table who had ordered the exact same dish 3 nights in a row, and she guessed he had just lost someone. She noticed the young woman at table number 7 constantly glancing at the clock, and she brought her a glass of warm water without being asked. It was the only thing that belonged to her in this room, the only thing poverty couldn't seize, and she clung to it the way a person clings to the last plank of wood in a rushing current. As the evening shift stretched toward late night, and the snow began falling thicker beyond the glass windows, Delia had no idea that within just a few hours, that tiny habit, that ability to see a human being when everyone else saw only a type of customer, would place her at the greatest turning point of her life. "I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place," Brenda said, and she didn't bother lowering her voice even though the child was sleeping only a few steps away. Her eyes swept over him from head to toe, paused at the frayed leather around the cuffs of his coat, then lifted into a smile that didn't reach the bottom of her eyes. "This is Castellano's. We serve by reservation, and tonight we're fully booked. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere a little less formal." Salvatore didn't answer right away. He looked past her shoulder into the room behind her, where at least 4 tables still sat empty, their white tablecloths untouched, the chairs still neatly tucked beneath the golden light. He didn't need to say what he saw. They both knew it was right there, plain and undeniable between them, and it was his silence, the way he allowed the truth to speak for itself instead of arguing, that made Brenda shift 1 foot slightly behind the host stand. "I only need a small table," he said, his voice low and even, so quiet that she had to lean forward a little to hear him. "Any quiet corner will do. The little girl won't bother anyone. I won't stay long." It was the kind of request that anyone, with even the smallest piece of professional conscience left, would have accepted in a single breath. But Brenda heard it as an opportunity to reaffirm the boundary she believed it was her duty to guard. "Those tables have already been reserved," she said, the lie sliding from her lips so smoothly that she almost seemed to believe it herself. "Our guests expect a certain atmosphere when they walk in here. You understand, don't you? There are places suited to certain people, and places that simply aren't." She let the sentence hang unfinished in the air. The meaning beneath that layer of false politeness laid bare so nakedly that one server standing nearby had to lower his eyes to the floor. Salvatore had lived long enough in a world where people constantly tested one another with small measures like this to recognize exactly what was happening. He didn't feel insulted in the way Brenda must have imagined. Anger, for him, had never been the first reaction. Instead, he simply watched in silence, noting, assessing, measuring the person standing before him the way he had measured hundreds of people before her, and what he saw didn't surprise him. It only made a familiar kind of weariness rise somewhere behind his ribs. He lifted his head and looked straight into her eyes. He said nothing at all. He only looked, and that look carried neither anger nor pleading, nothing of a man begging for a favor. It was still in a way that unsettled people, deep and flat as the surface of a lake whose bottom no one could guess. And in that brief moment, something very primitive inside Brenda gave a small shudder. She couldn't explain it. She only knew that the man in this old coat wasn't afraid of her in the way other rejected guests usually were, that beneath that tired and shabby appearance lay something she couldn't name, an absolute calm that belonged to people used to seeing fear in other people's eyes, not carrying it in their own. For 1 second, she almost stepped back. But then the habit of a life built on bullying those weaker than herself rose again, drowning out that faint warning instinct, and she reassured herself with the simplest possible logic that someone who looked like this couldn't possibly be a threat to her. She was wrong, more gravely wrong than she had ever been about anything in her life, but the night was still too young for her to understand that. "So," Brenda continued, recovering her familiar patronizing tone, "if you don't mind, you're blocking the way for guests who actually have reservations." Salvatore did not move from where he stood, though every word Brenda spoke was like a pebble thrown onto the still surface inside him. There had been a time, a very long time ago, when a sentence like that would have brought consequences the person who said it would never have had time to foresee. But tonight, he wasn't the man from those days. Tonight, He was only a father with an arm gone numb and a tiny life sleeping in trust against his shoulder. And it was that warm weight that kept him standing still, not restraint. He had learned very early, through lessons he never told anyone about, that the fastest way to understand a person was not to watch them when they were facing someone stronger than themselves, but to look at them when they believed they were standing before someone who had nothing to lose, someone who couldn't strike back, who had no power, who wasn't worth considering. In those moments, when people believed no one was watching and there was no price to pay, they revealed their true selves more clearly than any oath or social smile could ever conceal. And that was exactly what he was doing now, standing in silence in the warm dining room, letting the woman before him paint her own portrait with every word, every glance, every small choice she believed would never be examined. He didn't feel angry. What he felt, if it could be named, was closer to an old sadness, the sadness of a man who had seen the same truth too many times, that kindness and cruelty in a person were rarely decided by circumstance, but by what they chose to do when they believed no consequence was waiting. He thought of the people who had once sat across from him in closed rooms, powerful men who knew exactly who he was, and therefore wrapped themselves in perfect politeness, and he thought perhaps he trusted a person who could be kind even when no one forced them to be 1,000 times more than he trusted those men. Just then, Gianna stirred slightly on his shoulder, a tiny sigh slipping from her sleeping lips, her little hand tightening a little around the fold of fabric at his chest, as if searching for reassurance that he was still there. He immediately adjusted his posture, shifting her weight to the arm that could support her more firmly, lowering his shoulder so her cheek could rest more comfortably against his collar, and all of his attention, for one full heartbeat, left Brenda and settled entirely on the sleeping life against him. In that moment, the elegant room, the scornful woman behind the stand, the cold still clinging to his coat, all of it receded into a blurred noise, and the only thing left to him was that small warmth, that steady breathing, the silent promise he had made to the child from the day he first held her in his arms, that no matter how harsh this world became, she would always have a safe place to rest her head. She mustn't know, must never know, about the world he had walked out of. He had built an invisible wall around her, and every decision he made, even standing still and enduring tonight's insult instead of letting his old instincts speak, was another brick in that wall. He lifted his head, ready to say one last thing, one final attempt to give this woman a chance to choose again. But before he could open his mouth, another voice, gentle and hesitant, rose from the other side of the dining room. Delia had been standing about 10 steps away, a tray of freshly cleared water glasses still in her hands, and she had witnessed the entire scene from beginning to end. She had seen the man in the old coat, standing patiently in place, had seen the way he carefully shifted the sleeping child to his other arm with a tenderness no one could fake, and she had also seen the way Brenda looked at him, that same look Delia herself had endured hundreds of times over the years, the look that sorted people into the worthy and the unworthy in a single glance. Something in that scene touched the deepest place inside her, a place that exhaustion and poverty still hadn't managed to harden. She looked at the little girl with her softly curling black hair pressed against her father's collar, looked at the tiny hand clutching the fold of fabric, and she looked at the father holding his child with his whole body as if she were the only important thing left in the world. And she thought of all the nights she had stood on the other side of kindness, all the nights when she had longed for just one person to look at her as a human being instead of an obstacle to be swept aside. She didn't decide with reason. Her feet had already begun moving before the cautious part of her mind could speak up and remind her about Brenda, about the stolen tips, about the bitter truth that she had no right to interfere in the dining room manager's business. She set the water tray down on an empty table, quickly wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped closer, her voice soft and hesitant but clear enough to cut through the tense air between them. "Excuse me," she said, and she directed her words toward the man, not toward Brenda. A small choice, but not an accidental one. The little girl must be exhausted. It's so cold outside, and it's a shame to make her keep standing here in the lobby. Let me see what I can arrange. Salvatore turned to look at her, and for the first time since he had stepped through that door, something in his eyes softened. Not because he needed her help, but because after so much cold indifference, here, from the person with the least reason to care, was the only one willing to see. He recognized at once that this woman had nothing to gain from her kindness, that her faded uniform and worn shoes said she belonged among the scorned, not among those who handed out favors, And that was exactly what gave her gesture more weight than anything this entire elegant room could have offered. "Thank you," he said, and those two words alone, spoken in that deep, tired voice, were enough for her to understand that he meant them. But that fragile moment didn't last long. Brenda had watched the whole thing with anger gathering in waves behind her carefully made-up face. And the thought that a mere server would dare to openly go against her decision, right in front of her, inside the very territory she believed belonged to her, was something she couldn't tolerate. She stepped out from behind the host stand with quick, clipped strides, then seized Delia by the elbow, her fingers tightening more than necessary, and pulled her several steps back toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, out of the man's hearing. "What do you think you're doing?" Brenda hissed, her voice dropping into something sharp as a shard of glass, low enough that no guest could hear it, but clear enough for Delia to feel the full weight of the fury inside it. "I told him we were out of tables. Did you hear me say that? Or do you think your miserable little paycheck gives you the right to decide who sits where in my restaurant?" And Delia, standing there with her elbow still aching under the grip of those tight fingers, understood that she had just crossed a line she might have to pay dearly for. "Let me make one thing very clear to you," Brenda continued, still keeping her voice low, though every word seemed sharpened to a point. "If you take one more step toward that man, if you serve him even a single glass of plain water, I'll put it in your file tonight. And you already know what that means. I'll cut your weekend shifts, I'll deduct it from your tips, and if necessary, I'll find a reason to terminate your contract before this month is over. There's a whole line of girls out there ready to take your place tomorrow morning without asking any troublesome questions." She released Delia's elbow, almost flinging it away, then stepped back half a pace and folded her arms across her chest with the triumphant look of someone who believed she had just stamped out the first spark of rebellion. Delia stood still in that narrow, dim hallway, and for a few seconds, the whole world seemed to shrink into a cold calculation taking place inside her mind. She thought of her small room on the 3rd floor of an old building on the west side of the city, where the rent came due on the 1st, and the landlord had already reminded her twice about being late. She thought of the refrigerator that was almost empty, of the shoes wearing thinner beneath her feet while she still didn't dare buy a new pair, of the way a single canceled shift could push her from struggling into something she could no longer manage. She had no one to borrow from when things grew desperate, no savings account to draw from in a hard hour, no other door to knock on if this one closed. Her job at Castellanos, no matter how bitter it was, no matter how many insults she had to swallow every night, was still the only fragile thread keeping her from falling into the abyss whose edge she had stood beside too many times in her life. Every practical reason inside her screamed for her to turn away, to apologize to Brenda, to lower her head the way she always had, to let that man take care of himself, because he was a stranger, and her own stomach couldn't fill itself on kindness. But then she turned her head and looked back toward the dining room, through the narrow opening between the hallway and the main room, and she saw the little girl sleeping on the shoulder of her exhausted father. She saw that tiny hand still clutching the fold of his coat. She saw the way that man stood there patiently, in a sea of scornful eyes, without pleading and without anger, and something inside her, something that all those years of poverty still hadn't managed to kill, quietly rose and spoke more clearly than fear. She knew what it felt like to be looked at as if she didn't exist. She knew how deeply it cut into the bones, knew how it could make a person shrink from the inside out, and she knew that if she turned her back tonight, if she let fear win, she would become the very thing she hated most. She would become one more pair of eyes looking straight through a human being who needed to be seen. And that price, she realized, was more costly than losing this job, because there were some things that, once lost, no paycheck could ever buy back. She lifted her head, faced Brenda, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, wasn't defiant, but there was a new steadiness in it that even she hadn't expected. "I understand what you just said," she replied, "and I know I could lose my job over this, but I can't stand by and watch a child and her father be treated that way and pretend I didn't see anything. Put it in my file if you want. I'm still going to do the right thing." And after saying that, before fear could pull her back, she stepped out into the dining room again. Delia knew very well that Brenda would be watching her every move, and that if she placed an order through the official system, the man's name would appear on the screen, and everything would be over before it even had a chance to begin. So she didn't use the system. She went around to the back, into the small employee kitchen where there was a pitcher of milk and a warmer people still used during the late shift, and she heated a glass of warm milk herself. Then she quietly reached into the pocket of her apron, took out the few meager bills and tips she had saved that night, and placed them in the shared fund box, with a hastily written note saying she had taken one portion of milk, so no one later could accuse her of taking something from the restaurant without paying for it. It was all the tip money she had earned that night, the money that was supposed to be set aside for tomorrow's breakfast. But she didn't hesitate when she put it down, because to her, some things were worth more than a meal. She carried the glass of milk back out, and she chose a small table hidden behind a large pillar in the far corner of the dining room, a place that was difficult to see from the host stand, a quiet corner, exactly like the one the man had asked for. She quickly wiped the table, pulled out a chair, then stepped close to him and said softly, in a voice just loud enough for only him to hear, that she had prepared a place for him and his daughter in the inner corner, warm and discreet, and invited him to sit down and rest. Salvatore looked at her for a moment, and he understood at once even the things she didn't say. He understood the risk she was taking. He understood that this seat did not come from the restaurant's generosity, but from somewhere inside her own heart. And he quietly followed her toward that hidden table, setting the little girl down on the chair as gently as he could. Gianna opened her eyes for a brief moment, her sleepy gaze blinking beneath the soft golden light. Then she rested her head against the back of the chair again, hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly. Delia placed the warm glass of milk in front of the child, and her eyes paused on the worn old stuffed rabbit, one of its ears bent down and fraying at the seam, perhaps because it had been held through more nights than anyone could count. With a gesture as natural as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, she reached out and gently smoothed the rabbit's folded ear, shaping it upright again, fixing it neatly the way a mother would without needing anyone to tell her. Gianna looked up at her through lashes, still heavy with sleep, and gave her a dreamy smile, then whispered a tiny thank you before her eyes closed again, and in that small moment, something in Salvatore's chest tightened softly. He had seen too many people act sweetly toward him when they knew exactly who he was. He had grown too used to the kind of kindness carefully calculated to receive something in return, so a completely unguarded act of tenderness like this, given to his daughter by someone who neither knew nor needed to know who he was, touched him more deeply than he was willing to admit. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly, and in his voice there was a gentleness very few people in the world had ever heard. "You're putting yourself in trouble. I know that." Delia only shook her head lightly and smiled, a tired but honest smile. "There are times," she replied, "when the right thing doesn't ask whether it'll get you into trouble or not. It's simply the right thing." And when she turned away so the child could sleep in peace, Salvatore watched that slender figure in the faded uniform, and for the first time in a very long while, he truly saw a human being. When the child had settled back into sleep, and the dining room had sunk into the soft murmur of plates, silverware, and distant conversations, Salvatore sat down at that hidden table, placed the small cake box in front of him, and in that rare, quiet moment, memory pulled him back to another place, another time. He had met Rosa on a late summer afternoon many years before, in an old bookstore tucked away on a street hardly anyone noticed, a place he had stepped into not to buy books, but to avoid the people who were following him. And she had been standing there behind the counter, lifting her eyes to look at him with a gaze that carried none of the fear he had grown far too used to seeing in other people's eyes. She didn't know who he was. That was exactly what made him return to that bookstore the next day, and the day after that. To Rosa, he wasn't the name whispered in closed rooms. He wasn't the man others had to be wary of. He was simply a quiet man who liked to stand for hours between shelves of books and rarely spoke about himself. She had seen something in him that he himself had forgotten he once possessed, and in her gaze, he found his way back to a part of himself that the world he lived in had worn away long before. They married quietly, without display, and she stepped into his life with a silent courage, accepting the shadows he could never fully explain, setting only one condition, that their child would grow up far away from that world, that their child would never have to carry the things he had carried. He promised her that. He promised, with all the seriousness of a man who had never broken his word, that Gianna would have a clear and innocent childhood, that she would be shielded from every darkness, that she would grow up believing this world was a safe and gentle place. And then Rosa went away. She left too soon, as quietly as she had lived, leaving him with a daughter who had only just begun to walk, and an emptiness that no power on this earth could ever fill. He still remembered those final days. He remembered the way she held his hand and told him not to let grief turn him back into the man she had helped him leave behind. He remembered the way she smiled at him even when she was already so weak, and he remembered her telling him that she wasn't afraid to leave, that she was only sad she wouldn't be able to watch her daughter grow up. Every year, on her birthday, he did the same thing, not because it softened the pain, but because it was the way he kept his promise to her, that she would never be forgotten in their home. He bought a small cake, just enough for 2 people, himself and his daughter, and he lit a candle so Gianna would grow up, still knowing that she had once had a mother who loved her beyond measure, so Rose's name would still be spoken with love instead of sinking into silence. That was why he was here tonight, in this cold, snow-covered city, holding tightly to that cake box, as if it contained something more precious than anything money could buy, because to him, it truly did. That cake wasn't a dessert. It was a promise kept. It was a small flame he was determined not to let go out. It was the fragile thread connecting him and his daughter to the woman who had taught him that even a man who had walked out of darkness could still learn how to love in the light. He reached out and lightly touched the lid of the box, and he said softly to himself, so quietly that no one could hear, that he still remembered, that he would always remember. The phone in the inner pocket of his coat vibrated in 2 short pulses, a pattern only a very small number of people in this world could produce, because only a very small number of people had the number that could reach it directly. Salvatore glanced quickly toward Gianna, making sure the little girl was still sound asleep, with her stuffed rabbit in her arms. Then he turned slightly toward the wall, lowered his head, and pressed the phone to his ear. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The tired gentleness Delia had heard just a few minutes earlier had vanished completely, replaced by something low, flat, and cold enough to raise the hair on the skin of anyone who heard it. The voice of a man accustomed to giving orders, and accustomed to being obeyed without a single question. The person on the other end of the line was Gianni Russo, and Gianni never called at this hour unless something truly required him. Salvatore listened in silence, without interrupting, his eyes fixed distantly on an invisible point on the wall, while his mind received and arranged each piece of information with the cold precision of a man who had spent his whole life reading situations and anticipating the next move. There had been a problem simmering for weeks, involving one of the business properties under his control, an internal matter that needed to be dealt with decisively and required his direct presence, and Gianni was calling to confirm that everything was ready, that his men were on their way to the very place where he was sitting now, because Castellanos, though the people working here had no idea, had always been part of the network of places that belonged to him. "How much longer?" he asked. And that was all he said. 3 brief words without a wasted sound. He listened to the answer, nodded once though the man on the other end couldn't see it, then added, his voice still not changing in pitch but carrying a weight that made the command impossible to dispute, that Gianni should come as planned. But he had to enter very quietly, without display, without letting anything disturb his sleeping daughter. That was the only condition he set, and anyone who understood him knew it was also the condition he valued above all else, because in the entire world he ruled, with all its power, with all the people who had to be cautious when they spoke his name, there was only one thing that could not be touched, one boundary that no command, no business matter, no incident was allowed to cross, and that was the peace of the child sleeping only a few steps away from him. He ended the call without saying goodbye, because men like him had no need for such rituals, and slid the phone back into his coat pocket. Then, in the moment, he turned back toward the small table where his daughter was sleeping. A transformation crossed his face in the space of a heartbeat, the coldness dissolving like mist beneath sunlight, and when Gianna stirred faintly, murmuring a wordless call for her father through her dreams, the man who bent down beside her carried no trace of the one who had just given orders in the darkness. He reached out and gently brushed the curls from her forehead, whispering that Papa was still here, that she should go on sleeping. And his voice now was so warm and tender that no one could have believed it belonged to the same man who had spoken those words only seconds before. 2 men existed within the same body, one belonging to the darkness and its merciless laws, the other belonging to his little daughter and the promise he had made to her mother, and the boundary between those 2 men was Gianna, everything he was fighting to protect. That peace lasted only about 10 minutes. Brenda, after finishing with a group of guests in the central section, swept her eyes around the dining room with her usual habit of control, and her gaze stopped sharply on the hidden corner behind the pillar, the place that should have been empty, the place where the man in the old coat was now sitting with the sleeping child and a glass of warm milk on the table. For a moment, she stood frozen, not from surprise, but from anger rising so quickly that it flushed her neck red, because she understood at once what had happened. She understood that her order had been ignored, that the authority she believed was absolute in this small territory had just been openly challenged by a lowly server. She strode toward that table, her heels striking the stone floor in sharp, clipped beats, and this time she didn't bother lowering her voice. She didn't bother keeping on the false politeness she usually wore in front of guests. "I made myself very clear," she said, her voice loud enough for several nearby tables to turn and look. And that was exactly what she wanted, because for someone like Brenda, another person's public humiliation was a tool for proving her own power. She snapped around toward Delia, who had just stepped over when she saw Brenda charging toward them, and pointed straight at her face. "You. I told you not to serve this man. I said it to your face less than half an hour ago. And yet you still dared to sneak around behind my back, right here in my restaurant." Delia stood straight, her hands clasping lightly together, and though her heart was pounding hard, she didn't step back. "I only brought the little girl a glass of warm milk," she replied, her voice trembling slightly but still clear. "She's sleeping. They aren't bothering anyone." But that explanation only poured more oil onto the fire burning inside Brenda. "You're paid to do what I tell you, not to give yourself the right to decide who deserves what and who doesn't," she said through clenched words, then raised her voice into a declaration for the whole room to hear. "I want all three of you out of here right now. This man, the child, and you too. You can take your apron with you and leave, because as of this second, you don't work here anymore." A silence spread through that part of the room. A few diners set down their knives and forks, their eyes moving back and forth between the manager, whose face was red with anger, and the thin server standing there with trembling shoulders but her head still held high. Through the whole scene, Salvatore remained seated. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, didn't reveal a single sign of the storm quietly gathering behind his still eyes. He only watched, as he had watched from the beginning of the night, taking in every detail, the way Brenda chose to use her power not to serve, but to trample, the way she aimed at the weakest person in the room, the way she was willing to take away a person's livelihood simply because that person had dared to be kind. He had given her this chance, the chance she had no idea she was being given, the chance to choose again, to behave as a human being should, and she had thrown it away with both hands. There was a law he had lived by his entire life, that anyone who used strength to crush those who couldn't fight back would sooner or later have to face a greater strength. And tonight, the final limit of his patience was drawing very near. He looked at Delia, the woman who had just lost her job only because she had been kind to his daughter. Then he looked at Brenda, and in that moment, he knew that the time for watching was almost over. But before he could do anything, a small voice, sleepy and clear, rose from the chair beside him. "Papa," Gianna called, her voice still sleepy and soft as silk, her eyes half opening and blinking beneath the warm golden light, completely unaware of the tension stretched tight through the dining room around her. "Did we light the candle for Mama yet?" She rubbed her eyes with one tiny fist, hugged the stuffed rabbit close against her chest, and looked up at her father with all the clear expectation of a child of 5 who had suddenly remembered the most important thing about this night. In that instant, Salvatore turned fully toward her at once, using his own body to form a soft wall shielding her from Brenda, from the eyes now fixed on them, from everything that was happening, and his entire world in that moment narrowed to the small face looking up at him. He bent down to her eye level, and when he spoke, his voice was so gentle, it was as though nothing existed around them except father and daughter. "Not yet, sweetheart," he said, brushing her cheek lightly with his hand. "We're about to light it now. You sit still for me." Then, with hands that had once done things this world would never forgive, hands that now trembled ever so slightly, he pulled the box closer, loosened the ribbon, and opened the lid. Inside was a small cake, just enough for 2 people, simple and plain, and in the very center stood one slender white candle that hadn't yet been lit. He lifted the candle and set it straight, and the whole dining room, for some reason no one there could quite name, began to fall silent. The faint clatter of knives and forks stopped, the whispered conversations faded away, because even the most indifferent people in that room, the ones who only minutes earlier had looked at this man as someone who did not belong here, could feel that they were accidentally witnessing something sacred, something too private and too painful to keep pretending not to see. A woman at a nearby table raised a hand to cover her mouth. An older man quietly set down his glass of wine, and Delia, standing a few steps away with her eyes already blurred, finally understood the full meaning of the box the man had held so tightly from the moment he walked in. She understood why he had guarded it so carefully. She understood that this was not a dinner, but a remembrance, a small flame being lit for someone who could no longer sit at this table. Gianna looked at the candle with eyes brightening in childlike excitement, and she whispered, still in that clear, innocent voice untouched by adult sorrow, that Mama loved candles best, that Mama always said every candle was a wish, and she asked her father whether tonight she could make a wish for Mama. Those words, spoken so honestly and innocently from those small lips, did what no angry speech ever could. They broke the entire room open into a choking silence, made strangers turn their faces away to hide reddened eyes, made even the anger blazing across Brenda's face halt halfway, like a wave striking stone. Salvatore looked at his daughter, and in those eyes that were usually so cold, there now shone a light very few people in the world had ever seen. He nodded gently to her, and he said, his voice catching in his throat but still endlessly tender, "Of course, sweetheart. Tonight you make a beautiful wish for Mama. She'll hear it." He knew that in only a few minutes, everything in this room would change forever, that his men were about to walk through that door, that the world he had kept hidden was about to reveal itself beneath this golden light. But right now, he only wanted to hold this small, pure moment for one more heartbeat. The moment when his daughter could still live in a world where candles were only for wishes, and loss was still gentle enough to sound like something whispered into the dark. Salvatore felt the movement in the air before it happened, that familiar sense of something approaching, a sense he had learned to recognize long ago, and he knew this was not the place, not the moment, for his daughter to witness it. He lifted his eyes in search of Delia, and their gazes met in a quiet understanding that needed no words. He tilted his head ever so slightly toward the child, then toward the inner part of the restaurant. And Delia, though she still didn't fully understand what was unfolding, read the message in that gesture completely, that he was asking her to take Gianna away, to bring the little girl somewhere warm and safe, far from whatever was about to happen. She stepped to the child's chair, knelt down to her level, and smiled, a smile so gentle and warm it seemed to push everything else out of the room. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "I know a very special place back there, and it's so warm, with a chair that's very, very soft. Would you like to bring your bunny and your piece of cake in there with me? We'll find your bunny a really pretty place to sit." Gianna looked at her with brightening eyes, nodded eagerly, and reached out her tiny hand to take Delia's with such trust that it seemed as if they had known each other for a very long time. Salvatore cut a small piece of cake and placed it on a plate, carefully removed the candle to save it, then handed the plate to his daughter along with a kiss pressed to her curly hair, whispering that she should go with the lady for a little while, that Papa would come in to see her soon, and that she should hold on to her wish for Mama and not forget it. The little girl beamed, hugging her stuffed rabbit and the plate of cake close, then obediently followed Delia, chattering as she went, telling her what her bunny's name was, and that Bunny also liked warm milk very much. Delia led the child across the dining room, around a small hallway, and into a quiet side room in the back that was usually used for private parties, a cozy space completely separated from the main area, with a soft settee and gentle lighting, cut off from all the sounds and all the watching eyes in the room outside. She set the little girl on the settee, tucked a small pillow behind her back, arranged the stuffed rabbit neatly beside her like a loyal companion, and placed the cake plate on the low table in front of her. Gianna happily began telling the rabbit about the wish she planned to make for her mother, her small legs swinging, her face glowing in that warm circle of light, completely joyful and peaceful, unaware, and forever meant to remain unaware of anything waiting to be settled in the room beyond. Delia sat beside her for a little while longer, gently stroking her hair, and she made herself a silent promise that no matter what happened out there, this child would remain safe in this warmth, allowed to laugh, allowed to dream about her wish. When she glanced back toward the dining room one last time before disappearing fully into the back, she caught Salvatore's eyes following her, and he gave her a slight nod, a nod filled with deep gratitude and a trust he rarely gave anyone. And in that silent nod, something had been entrusted to her, and something else was ready to begin. The glass door at the entrance opened, bringing with it a rush of cold air and a few stray snowflakes, and 4 men stepped inside in dark suits tailored to perfection, moving with the calm, purposeful bearing of men who knew exactly who they were and what they had come here to do. The man in front was a graying man in his 50s, with a hard-lined face and sharp eyes that swept across the entire dining room in a single glance, and gathered everything he needed to know, and he walked straight toward the hidden corner where Salvatore was sitting without hesitating, without searching, as if he had known exactly where the man he needed to meet would be. Brenda, still standing in the middle of the dining room with her anger not yet cooled, looked up at the newly arrived group with the irritation of someone about to order them to make a reservation or wait their turn, but those words never had time to leave her mouth, because the graying man stopped in front of the small table, and he did something that seemed to drain every drop of blood from Brenda's face. He bowed his head, a solemn and deeply respectful bow, the kind of bow people gave only to someone standing many ranks above them, and he spoke, his deep, clear voice ringing through the silence spreading across the room. "Mr. Marchetti, everything is ready according to your orders." That name fell into the dining room like a stone thrown into still water, and its ripples spread at once. At a table near the window, a richly dressed man in his middle years, who had been laughing loudly only moments earlier, suddenly went pale and quickly lowered his head toward his plate, signaling for the person with him to stay quiet. In another corner, a couple having dinner exchanged a frightened glance, then quietly sat straighter, not daring to look toward that table a second time. The name Marchetti, whispered in closed rooms all across the south side of the city, the name that even those who believed themselves powerful avoided saying aloud, had now been spoken in the open daylight of this elegant dining room, and it carried with it the full weight of things people never said. But everyone understood. Brenda stood rooted to the spot, and she felt as though the ground were sliding away beneath her feet. Her mind tried desperately to piece everything together. The man in the old worn coat whom she had looked down on, refused, insulted, and demanded be thrown out the door, the man she had placed among those unworthy of sitting inside this restaurant, was the very name that even the wealthiest and most powerful guests in the room lowered their heads upon hearing. Her lips parted and closed again, but no sound came out, and the hands that had just been pointing and giving orders now hung limp and trembling at her sides. Salvatore was in no hurry. He didn't leap to his feet, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything dramatic. He only carefully set the candle he was holding down on the table, as if it were still the most important thing, then lifted his head, and for the first time all evening, he allowed his true self to appear fully in his eyes. The patience of a tired father was gone. The shell of a scorned guest was gone. All that remained was the absolute and cold calm of a man who held more power in his hands than anyone in this room could possibly imagine. He looked straight at Brenda, the woman who had just fired a kind employee and demanded that his daughter be thrown out into the snow, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud. In fact, it was very soft, but every word landed clear and cold in the room that had gone utterly silent. "Sit down," he said. "You and I need to talk about the way you run my restaurant." Salvatore rose from his chair, unhurried, every movement carrying the calm of a man who never needed to move quickly, and he took one step closer to Brenda, who was still standing, rooted in place as if frozen in the middle of the dining room. "You thought tonight was the first time I had ever set foot in this place," he said, his voice low and even, without a trace of anger, and it was precisely that absence of anger that made each word more frightening than any shout could have been. "You were wrong. I have been watching the way this place is run for far longer than you think. I know about the numbers that don't match in the tip records. I know that every month, money that should belong to the servers quietly disappears before it ever reaches their hands." Brenda's face went chalk white, and she stammered, trying to salvage whatever she could. "I don't understand what you're talking about. Our books have always been transparent. You can check them." But Salvatore only shook his head slightly, and he continued, each sentence like a door quietly closing behind her, cutting off one escape route after another. "I already have checked," he replied. "I know about the server you fired last summer just because he dared to ask why his tips were short. I know about the assistant cook you forced to work overtime without pay, then threatened to dismiss when she complained. I know about the guests you quietly pushed out the door because they weren't dressed finely enough, didn't look rich enough, didn't suit your taste, exactly the way you did to me tonight. I have every one of their names. I have the dates. I have all of it." Each name he mentioned was like a brick pulled from the wall Brenda had spent years building around herself, and she could feel it collapsing, piece by piece, right before the eyes of the diners watching in breathless silence. "That's slander," she blurted, her voice beginning to crack, with none of the cold arrogance from a few minutes earlier left in it. "You can't prove anything. I've worked here for years. I've dedicated myself to this place." Salvatore looked at her for a long while, and in his eyes there was no satisfaction of a victor, only the cold weariness of a man who had seen too many people just like her. "You call taking food from the mouths of the people working under you dedication," he said softly. "You call using your small title as manager to humiliate people who can't fight back dedication. I gave you a chance tonight, Brenda, though you didn't know it. When I walked in with my daughter in my arms, I wasn't testing you. I was only a tired father who needed a place to sit, and you showed me exactly who you were when you believed I was nothing, when you believed I had no power to make you pay a price. That is when a person reveals their true nature, not when they stand before the strong, but when they stand before someone they believe is weak." Brenda opened her mouth to say something more, but this time, not a single word would come out, because she looked around and saw the thing she feared most. She saw the diners turning their faces away. She saw the other servers standing close to the wall with a look she had never seen them dare direct at her before. A look no longer filled with fear, but with the quiet relief of people who had just watched their oppressor finally have her mask stripped away. Her shoulders sank, and the air of authority she had wrapped around herself for years vanished completely, revealing beneath it a small and empty person who had grown far too used to building her sense of importance on the suffering of others. She took one step back, then another, and for the first time that night, the woman who was used to judging others no longer dared lift her head and look anyone in the eye. Salvatore turned to Gianni, and he spoke in the calm voice of a man making a carefully considered decision, not an impulsive one born in anger, saying that from this moment on, Brenda no longer held any position in the restaurant, that she would be escorted out tonight, and that tomorrow morning, a complete review of the books would be carried out, so every amount of money ever taken from the staff would be returned in full, down to the very last cent. Gianni gave one decisive nod, and that was all that was needed. There was no violence, no hand placed on her, only the absolute weight of power operating with order and the coldness of consequences that could no longer be reversed. Brenda stood there, and she understood that any pleading now would be meaningless, that the small world she had ruled through fear had collapsed completely in only a few short minutes, and she quietly removed the name tag from her chest, set it on the counter with trembling hands, then lowered her head and walked toward the door under the eyes of all the people she had once looked down on. When the glass door closed behind her, Salvatore turned back to face the entire room, and he spoke, not to threaten, but to make clear something he wanted everyone there to remember. "I want everyone in this room to understand one thing," he said, his deep voice rising through the stillness. "I'm not doing this because she insulted me. I've been insulted many times in my life, and I've learned how to let those words pass. I'm doing this because she used the little power she had to trample people who had no way to protect themselves. That is something I never forgive. A person with power can be judged not by how they treat their equals, or those above them, but by how they treat the weakest person standing before them, the person who can't answer back, the person who has nothing to give and nothing to threaten with. That is the true measure of a human being." His words fell into the hearts of those listening and remained there, because every one of them understood that he wasn't only speaking about Brenda. He was speaking about something larger, a principle he himself had chosen to live by in a world that rarely respected any principles at all. Then his eyes softened, and he turned toward the door leading into the room inside, where Delia had just taken his daughter, the woman who had risked losing the few things she had simply to bring a glass of warm milk to a child she didn't even know. "And I want everyone to understand this too," he continued, his voice now carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Tonight, among all the people sitting in this elegant room, only one person saw a tired child and a father who needed help, and that person wasn't the richest or the most powerful one here. That person had the least to lose and still was willing to gamble everything, not to gain anything in return, but only because it was the right thing to do. True kindness never asks for a reward, and perhaps that is exactly why it is the rarest and most precious thing one human being can offer another." He paused for a moment, his eyes moving toward the servers, standing silently along the wall. Then he added, more softly, like a reminder meant as much for himself as for them, that power would fade, wealth would change hands, but the way a person treated someone weaker, when no one forced them to be kind, would remain forever, like an unerasable mark of who they truly were. Salvatore walked toward the inner room, and when he crossed the threshold, the first image that met his eyes softened something inside his chest. Gianna was sitting on the soft settee, a little frosting still clinging to her mouth, eagerly telling her stuffed rabbit about her wish, while Delia sat beside her, listening with such gentle attention that it seemed nothing in the world mattered more than the story of a 5-year-old child. Delia looked up when she saw him, and a flicker of confusion crossed her eyes, because now she knew who he was. She had faintly heard the name spoken out there, and she didn't know how to behave before a man whose name could make an entire room hold its breath. She stood, lowered her head slightly, and began to stammer an apology for taking it upon herself to do things that perhaps went beyond her duties. But Salvatore raised one hand softly to stop her, and he spoke in a voice that was warm and carried none of the distance of power. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "Tonight, you were the only person in this entire place who behaved according to the meaning of being human. And I didn't come here for you to be afraid of me. I came here to thank you." He sat down in a chair across from her, keeping a proper distance, and he looked at her with the direct gaze of a man speaking to an equal, not handing down charity. "I know you lost your job tonight because of what you did for my daughter," he continued. "And I know that for someone like you, that isn't a small thing. I know the price you just paid, but I'm not going to stand here and hand you a stack of money and pretend that settles everything, because that would insult the very beauty of what you did. Your kindness isn't something to be bought back with money." Delia stood in silence, not understanding where he was leading the conversation, and he went on, slowly and clearly. "I own more establishments than this restaurant, and all of them share one problem I've been thinking about for a long time. I can hire people who know how to smile at the right moment, who know how to say the right scripted lines, but I can't hire what you already carry inside you, the ability to truly see a human being when everyone else sees only a shadow. That isn't a skill people can be taught in a training session. It is something a person either has or doesn't have, and you have it more than anyone I've ever met." He paused, then made his offer, not as a favor bestowed from above, but as an opportunity being given to someone who deserved it. "I want you to build and lead the way the staff at all my establishments learn to treat people, not according to a script, but according to the way you treated my daughter tonight. I want to pay you a salary worthy of the true value of what you bring, not the wage people still pay someone they consider invisible. But this is your decision, not mine. You have every right to refuse, and if you do refuse, I'll still make sure you have a decent job anywhere you choose." Delia stood there, and for one long moment she couldn't say a word, because in her entire life, no one had ever looked at her and told her that what she had always considered simple human decency, the kindness she had kept giving without ever expecting anything in return, could be something of such value. Her eyes blurred, but she did not let the tears fall, and when she spoke, her voice was choked with emotion but steady and full of dignity. "All my life," she said softly, "I've never helped anyone because I expected to be repaid. I helped your daughter tonight because she needed help. It was that simple. But if you truly believe I can teach other people how to see human beings, then I'll accept, not because of the salary, but because I know how painful it is to be looked through as if you don't exist. And if I can help even one person suffer that feeling a little less, then that is work I'll do with my whole heart." Gianna, who had been listening to the conversation between the two adults with the curious ears of a child, even though she didn't understand all of its meaning, now slid down from the settee and walked over to Delia with her stuffed rabbit in her arms and the plate of cake still half full. She looked up at her with large, clear eyes, and with the unhesitating honesty of childhood, she held the plate out toward her. "Eat with me," the little girl said. "This is my mama's birthday cake. My mama would be very happy if you ate with us. My mama always said cake tastes best when you share it with someone you like." Delia went still for a moment. Then she bent down to the child's level and accepted the small piece of cake from those tiny hands, as if it were the most precious gift in the world, because to her, it truly was. Then Gianna, after a moment of serious thought in the way children often do before making great decisions, lifted her stuffed rabbit and pushed it into Delia's hands. "Bunny wants to stay with you for a little while," the child declared firmly. "Bunny likes you now. Bunny only lets people who are really kind hold him." Delia received the worn old stuffed rabbit, the one with the ear she had just straightened so neatly, and something inside her broke open softly. Not pain, but a sweet swell of emotion rising from some very deep place, because she understood that the gift this child had just given her, that pure and unconditional trust, was something no salary or position could ever buy, and something she had longed for through all the lonely years of her life without ever daring to say it aloud. Salvatore watched the scene in silence, and in his usually cold eyes, a rare tenderness appeared, because he knew his daughter was not pretending. A child only gave her most beloved stuffed rabbit to someone her young heart truly felt was safe and good, and his daughter's innocent instinct had just confirmed exactly what he had already seen in this woman. He lifted the small cake onto the low table between the three of them, carefully set the white candle in the very center, and this time, after an entire long evening of waiting, he lit it. The small flame flickered to life and trembled gently, its warm golden light falling over the three faces gathered around the table. The father who carried a whole world of darkness within him, yet still kept one clear corner of his heart for his child. The little girl who still believed candles were only for wishes, and that loss could still be gentle. And the stranger who had stepped into their lives through a glass of warm milk and a rabbit's ear set right again. Gianna pressed her small hands together, squeezed her eyes shut, and whispered her wish for her mother with all the innocent reverence she had. Then she blew out the candle, and a thin curl of smoke rose into the lamplight before dissolving into the air. In that quiet moment, no one said anything, because nothing more needed to be said. Three people from three entirely different worlds sat together in the warm glow of a candle just extinguished, bound not by power or money, but by the simplest and most enduring thing one human being can offer another: kindness given without asking anything in return, and the warmth of finally being truly seen by someone. Many years passed since that snow-covered winter night, and Gianna was no longer the 5-year-old child who had slept against her father's shoulder, but had grown into a young girl old enough to begin understanding that her father was not like other fathers, that there were rooms he entered where everyone fell silent, that there were things about his world she had never been told. One evening, as father and daughter sat together, she looked up at him and asked, why, out of all the nights he had lived through, that night at the restaurant years ago was the one he spoke of more than any other, the night he seemed never to forget no matter how many years had gone by. Salvatore was silent for a long while. Then he told her, in the deep, warm voice he reserved only for his little girl, that he had spent most of his life among people who believed power meant the ability to make others afraid, that a person's worth was measured by how many people they could force to bow their heads. But that night, he said, he had been reminded of a truth he had almost forgotten, that real power did not lie in the ability to crush someone when you could, but in choosing not to do it, in using the strength you had to protect instead of to trample. He told her that the person who had left the deepest impression on him that night was not the most powerful person in the room, but a woman who had nothing in her hands except a heart, a woman who had been willing to risk every little thing she had just to be kind to a strange child, without knowing that kindness would ever be repaid. And he told her that a human being's dignity had never been decided by the clothes they wore, the money they possessed, or the position they held, but by the way they chose to treat others in the moments when no one forced them to be good, the moments when kindness brought them nothing except itself. Gianna listened, and though she was still young, she understood that her father was giving her something more precious than any fortune, a way to look at the world and to look at people. As for Delia, her life had turned in a direction she had never dared to dream of. The woman who had once been invisible in a faded uniform had become the person who taught hundreds of others how to truly see one another, how to treat every guest who walked through the door not as a walking wallet, but as a human being carrying an entire story. And in her workplace, there was always an old stuffed rabbit, with its ear neatly straightened, placed with honor on a shelf, a quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest act of kindness we give away, when we expect nothing at all, is the very thing that changes our whole life. And if that night's story teaches us anything, it is that kindness given without expecting repayment is the true wealth any one of us can possess, that the way we treat someone weaker than ourselves, when no one is watching, is the truest measure of who we are, and that simply choosing to look at one another with a caring heart can make us a warm light in someone else's darkness. If this story has touched your heart, please press like, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can listen together to many more meaningful and deeply moving stories every day. How do you feel about tonight's story? And which character left the deepest emotion in you? Please leave a comment, sharing the feelings from the depths of your heart, because we always hope to hear what you want to say. Thank you for spending your time listening until the very last moment. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love every day. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next stories.